Joining us now is Eric Olson. He's an expert on Central America and Mexico. He has spent more than 20 years living and working in Latin America. Sir, welcome to our show. 19 candidates competing for the country's top job. 2 would-be candidates banned from running by local laws. What are the stakes here?
Well, this is the region, Central America's largest country, the biggest economy. It's still relatively small by global standards, but it's still an important country, and it borders with Mexico. And there have been enormous numbers of Guatemalans leaving, heading through Mexico to the United States. So there's a lot at stake here about the future of this mostly Mayan country. The problem is that the process of electing a new candidate has been marred by irregularities, by corruption. One candidate is now in prison in the United States. So there have been a lot of problems, and I think that's lent itself to what appears to be a low voter turnout. We won't know until the end, but at this point it looks like it's been relatively light turnout.
We're talking about the most populous country in Central America. And as of 2014, Guatemala only ranks 31st of 33 Latin American and Caribbean economies in terms of Human Development Index. What must the next leader do?
Well, as I mentioned, Guatemala is a majority Mayan country. It has a significant indigenous population. They're more than Mayans, but primarily they're Mayan. And so the country has seen its economy been very skewed. There's a great deal of inequality in Guatemala. The Western Highlands of Guatemala are a location of great hunger. As many as 80% of children under the age of 5 are malnourished or undernourished in the Western Highlands. And that's where people are primarily leaving from Guatemala. There's a climate change that's had a negative effect on their corn and coffee production, and people are more and more desperate. So I think Guatemalans would like to think the next president would provide some solutions to these problems, but I also know there's deep skepticism because of the extreme corruption in that country.
What about gang violence? What must the next president do to tackle that issue?
Well, gang violence is a problem, mostly in urban areas of Guatemala, in areas where there's overcrowding, high concentrations of poor people who have fled the countryside, where there's not good government services. I think one of the main things the new government has to do is renew its strategy to ferret out corruption. Corruption affects the police, it affects the prison system, it affects the justice system. And as long as those institutions of government are weakened by corruption, there will be violence, there will be gangs, there will be homicides, there will be impunity that are not being addressed. So it's very worrisome that this problem has gotten worse over the last 4 years and not better.
Now let's talk about immigration. Guatemala ranks number 10 in terms of the number of immigrants it sends to the U.S. How do you think the next president will go about dealing with Washington?
Well, it's hard to know. Depends who the next candidate, who becomes president. I think in general, the Guatemalans are inclined to be cooperative with the United States, but there are obviously limits to what they can do. Again, people are fleeing because of starvation and lack of opportunities. And unless Guatemala is willing to deal with these problems and the corruption that's infected its institutions, that migration is going to continue to exit. The Guatemalan people will continue to leave the country. So I think if there's going to be a solution, quote unquote, or addressing the drivers of that migration, you have to deal with these problems at the institutional level and with corruption.
Eric Olson, thank you so much for your insight.
You're very welcome.